Dr. Hamer, he had the insight after studying cancer patients and saw that there was a specific reason that the testicles have a purpose and have a function, and that the formation of cancer within the testicle is actually a biological solution to a problem.
Today's guest, Melissa Sell, is one of the most knowledgeable practitioners of German New Medicine, or GNM. GNM, discovered by Dr. Hamer in the late 1970s, is a new understanding of human biology and how it applies to medicine and disease. Based in Los Angeles, Melissa is one of the leading voices sharing Dr. Hamer's amazing work, healing people with trauma all over the world. In this episode, we learn how shocking life traumas initiate adaptive survival programs that are misinterpreted as disease, why understanding your psyche and biology will help you maintain homeostasis. Finally, Melissa reveals the biggest misconception about disease and how knowing it could literally save your life. This is Eyes Wide Open with me, your host, Laurence Easeman. Big Tech wants to censor the truth and restrict our freedoms. They can take away my channel. They can take away my platform. They can even take away my Balenciaga sponsorship deal. But they can't take away my mailing list. So if you want to stay connected and get my weekly newsletter, sign up by following the link in the description below. Now, it's time for our guest. Melissa Sell, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you on. I've been watching your videos I've been binge watching your videos recently, and they're really cool. Some really, really cool information. And I know we're going to talk about German New Medicine today, and I've kind of dipped my toe into it recently. I spoke to Mike Merrill about it, been watching things online, and it's so fascinating. And I'd like to just get straight into it, really. And I think one of the biggest contradictions that may shock people is the two perspectives that GNM has and Western medicine on cancer. In our current paradigm, one of the biggest shocks that we can face is cancer diagnosis that may lead to a further diagnosis that you've got 6 months to live, which can be probably the worst news anybody wishes to hear. However, in German New Medicine, this has an opposite connotation, whereas cancer is seen as a healing modality rather than something as a death sentence. Can you tell us, how you came to take that understanding?
It was hearing Dr. Hamer's story about what happened to him and the connections he put together. So he had a traumatic loss. He lost his son, and then he developed testicular cancer. And then he went on to connect these dots and found that the cancer wasn't something going wrong in the body. That's the big takeaway, is that the cancer is there for a specific biological purpose. And at first, people may be like, what do you mean a specific biological purpose? There's extra cells and the body is growing these cells out of control, because that's the conventional medicine perspective. There's an idea that there are cells in the body that are no longer being regulated by the body. They've gone rogue because of DNA damage or genetic conditions. And we think that the body is doing something fundamentally wrong, that these cells should not be there, that this is a mistake and error. But Dr. Hamer, he had the insight after studying cancer patients and saw that there was a specific reason that the testicles have a purpose and have a function, and that formation of cancer within the testicle is actually a biological solution to a problem. So the problem was he lost his son. And so in nature, if you lose offspring, what is nature's solution to that? Is to create more offspring. And for the man, where does that take place? Within the testicle. And so he saw that there's a biological rhyme and reason for the development of these extra cells, and that by understanding what tissue type is affected, we can backtrack and find out what type of shock, what did this person experience that caused their ancient biology to wake up in a particular way in order to help them to solve that problem. And so conventional medicine looks at the body out of context. It looks at the cells and says, oh no, these are extra cells. These shouldn't be here. Let's remove them. Dr. Hamer looked at the cells within the context of biology, within the context of embryology, within the context of evolution. And when you zoom out big enough, you see, oh, whoa, this makes perfect sense. Actually, these cells aren't random. It's not an error, it's not a mistake, it's intentional, it's purposeful, and it's biological. And so that's the big story of this work. And he found at first he thought it just applied to cancer, but then he took these findings and saw that these biological laws applied to a cold, a pimple, a hemorrhoid, not just cancer. And so this is an entire system for understanding and decoding your symptoms through this lens of how is this helping my body to adapt to my environment.
So we're led to believe that cancer kills, yeah. And I lost both of my grandparents on my mother's side to lung cancer, and it wasn't a nice ending for them. It was quite traumatic and stressful and painful and all those things. They had radiotherapy and other treatments. Are we to understand that it's not the cancer that kills? It's something else, or it's the treatments that we receive as a result of the cancer diagnosis.
Yes, there's not a simple answer to that because it's multifactorial. There's so much going on in an individual who ends up dying with an adaptation program. So, one situation could be that the conflict happened and didn't ever end. So, it went on for an extended period of time. Now, in nature, out in the wild, when conflicts occur, it's a pretty fast process. Either you are fighting for your life and you're surviving, you're dying in that moment. But these programs, they wouldn't last for a very long time. If, however, in our modern world, in our modern brains, we have the capacity to be conflicted about something for a very, very long time. And there's only a certain amount of time that certain tissues can adapt before the organism breaks down because it's metabolically expensive to be in conflict. Your body is taking more and more energy. And so you may waste away. You may, die because your tissues simply cannot continue to adapt to the ongoing conflict. So that's one situation where a person may pass away. And again, would you say that it's because of the cancer? Not really. You'd say that, the body, the cancer itself, and some certain biological tissues, the cancer itself is forming to help you to resolve the conflict. But if you never resolve the conflict, it's the lack of resolution really that leads to the death
Mm.
rather than cancer itself. So the cancer itself is, the effect of the cause being the unresolved conflict. Now, another situation is where you resolve the conflict and your body begins the repair and healing process. But if that conflict had gone on for such a long time, sometimes the healing repair work is too extensive. So there's excessive swelling in the brain. Again, there's limitations of matter. And so when we reach that point of limitation of matter, then the organism may not be able to survive due to excessive brain pressure, due to, a blockage in some cases. And that's where, in this model, it's not complete throw away everything in conventional medicine. It's you can use it much more wisely. So, surgery, for example, can be very helpful to remove a tumor that's grown too large because of
Mm.
excessive conflict. In nature, that organism probably wouldn't survive if the colon tumor grew so large that it blocked the passageway. But in our modern society, we have the technology where we can just remove the tumor. But still, you have to resolve the conflict because we can remove the tumor. And if the conflict remains unresolved, the tumor will come back. And so we have to take all of these things into consideration, but rarely is it ever just the cancer that actually kills a person. I personally believe that it's fear, the fear that builds as a result of the diagnosis, the idea that something is wrong with me can create existence conflicts, causing water retention. And we add conflict on top of conflict when we don't understand our biology. And so that's why, to say cancer kills people is a complete misconception because, again, rarely is it actually the physical tissue cells of the adaptation program that are leading to the demise of the individual.
We're, nearly 100 years into cancer research, and we're still no nearer to getting a solution or finding out what it is. And millions upon millions and millions of dollars and pounds are being given to cancer charities, but yet we don't know what it is. We don't know what it's caused by. So there's something not quite right, is there, with Western allopathic medicine if they don't even have a theory or an idea about what this is. Whereas German medicine has a very clear idea, a very clear set of principles to help us understand what's going on. So just on that basis alone, it trumps, what the best of what Western medicine can offer in relation to analyzing and being able to diagnose disease and these problems. And I know you use the word conflict a lot in GNM, and probably one of the things about what makes it difficult to take on board GNM is the terminology is a different language than what we currently use. But would you say that a conflict is similar to what we understand as trauma?
Certainly, yes.
So it's various traumas that we face throughout our lives, whether that's physical or emotional or even psychic, if you like, spiritual traumas. These can create adaptations within the body, and that creates what we would understand as illness. But the reality is it's a healing mode. Is that a kind of a kind of a clunky understanding of what GNM is?
Yeah, it's a great description. It's the conflict shock. So this is also called the Dirk Hamer syndrome in honor of Dr. Hamer's son, who that is why we have this knowledge today is because Dr. Hamer's son tragically shot. He survived for 4 months and ended up dying in his father's arms. And then Dr. Hamer developed testicular cancer, and so he made that connection when a shock happens. And so the conflict shock has some specific criteria. So it has to be highly acute and dramatic, so it's something that strikes you in that moment. And in the moment, you're caught off guard, you're unprepared, you're caught on the wrong foot, and you feel completely isolated in the
Mhm.
moment. You feel all alone. And so when that occurs, it strikes you in such a way that your psyche interprets and your brain registers in a particular region depending on the content of the conflict. So, depending on what happened, whether it was a death fright of a lion chasing after you, the loss of your child, a separation conflict, something being torn from you, not being able to bite someone. So, depending on the content of what happened, your brain automatically, and this goes beyond our psychology. So this isn't a mental process, this is a biological process.
Mhm.
It is assessed by your ancient psyche, your biological apparatus that's keeping you alive, that's constantly detecting what's going on in your environment, that acts and registers what's gone on before your before your conscious mind can even say, "Oh, this was shocking to me." Before you can even formulate those words, the biological program has begun because your psyche interprets, your brain registers the exact region that needs to adapt in order to help you survive whatever the situation is. So in Dr. Hamer's situation, the loss of his son, tragic loss. My biology perceives I've lost my offspring. And so it registered in his brain, and on the level of the testicle, there was an adaptation process that began. And so when we look at the cancer itself is the biological solution to the content of his conflict was the loss. Or, for lung cancer would be the death fright. And so the body is always doing whatever is necessary to help the organism to best survive the situation.
So in Dr. Harmer's example, he lost his son, and the biological organism, in its drive for survival, decided that it was time for Dr. Harmer to have another child, or potentially have another child, and make his testicles, if you like, work again, or give him the the extra oomph he needed to produce another child, and that's what the cancer was.
Exactly.
Wow. And that's the same application for all cancers. It's a growth or it's a reduction in cells in order to deal with whatever that threat is to the organism. It seems quite primitive. It seems quite a primitive operation, and it's kind of like a primitive operation operating in a sophisticated society, which is kind of run by language and all this technology, which is alien maybe to the adaptation process of the human body.
Well, our bodies are very old. Our bodies have ancient programming that evolved. Think of every ancestor that ever existed in order for you to be here today. So
Mm,
within you lies the adaptive wisdom of all of those ancestors. So every time an ancestor was in a pickle, a survival pickle, and the body did something in order to help that organism survive, that survival adaptation got coded in. And so now we have the accumulation of millions and millions of years of adaptive wisdom inside of our bodies. And
mm,
so, the conscious mind and language, we've been doing this thing for maybe 5,000 years, but these bodies have been running and operating for millions. And so that's why the big profound thing about this wisdom is we're getting in tune with our ancient biology
yeah.
rather than using our educated minds to say, oh, this is, we have primitive minds really when it comes to understanding what our biology is doing. And
Mhm.
this knowledge gets you back in harmony with the ancient wisdom, the things that ancient people recognized, ancient cultures and societies, even The German New Medicine, the other name for this is Germanische Heilkunde, which is the Germanic, roughly translated to the Germanic healing knowledge. And Germanic refers to not Germany, the country, but Germania and the ancient Germanic culture that lived in harmony with nature, that
Yeah.
lived alongside nature and
Well,
didn't.
it's pre-agricultural revolution, isn't it? It's before when we were still hunter-gatherers and our body, the organism had developed over hundreds of thousands of years to deal with its environment. And, it's kind of an area that I'm looking at quite a lot now. And it seems to be a lot of areas that connect to this time in our history. And it seems as if this place we're in now, this alien environment, this civilization, if you like, is that the body hasn't adapted to it. So it's all these alien stresses and stimuli are causing these modern diseases, if you like, because we've lost our touch with who we are. Can you give us some examples of patients that you've treated? Because as a GM and E&M practitioner, you've been doing this quite a while now, and I assume you've seen lots of people come through your practice, and you've had many success stories. Can you give us a few examples of case histories where you've turned people's lives around just from understanding GNM?
Yes, so there's a woman I worked with recently, and she was dealing with severe psoriasis. And so psoriasis is a thick, scaly skin condition that's, itchy and inflammatory and uncomfortable. And the conventional world says, this is an autoimmune condition. Your body's attacking itself. Here, take these steroids. So what steroids do are to put the body back into sympathetic activity, which causes the symptoms to appear to subside. But long term, people are aware that steroids long term are not helpful. They can provide temporary relief of symptoms, but they don't address the cause. And
Yeah.
that's the theme with
They
all
don't
of,
know the cause. They don't know what causes psoriasis or eczema. They just say, "Oh, sorry, we don't know what the problem is." They've never got an answer.
no idea. And so,
Yeah.
she also did all the alternative things. So she was seeing a naturopath, taking supplements, doing coffee enemas, saunas, sun exposure, so all of the alternative holistic remedies. She tried every one of those, yet this symptom was persisting for her. And so when we look at this from the GNM GHK perspective, we look at the symptom. Okay, so you have psoriasis. Psoriasis involves the epidermis. So the squamous epithelial skin cells, which is ectoderm, derived from the ectoderm germ layer, and it's controlled from the cerebral cortex. So we have to understand that, because when we understand the tissue level adaptation, we can work backwards to find out, okay, so what is going on here? So we know based on this symptom, she suffered a separation conflict. And
Hmm.
so the location of the symptom primarily was between her breasts and on her belly. So all on her chest was where it was the worst. And so we're looking at, okay, so who was the person that you were separated from? Because a separation conflict is about a person, someone that you either are wanting contact with, you want to bring close to you, or someone you want to push away.
Hmm.
And so the epidermis, the skin adapts by eroding tissue cells during the conflict activity. And so we erode and lose these tissue cells because, and you might say, well, why would the body erode its own tissues? Well, it's to help the organism, the individual, to cope with this separation. So let's say you're wanting this contact or you're wanting to push someone away. The biological answer to that is to numb the area, to lose the tissue cells so you are less affected by the intensity of this separation.
Hmm.
Also, there's short-term memory loss that goes along with this conflict so that you can forget the person that you're missing.
Wow.
And so that is the body's answer to the situation. And so we had to look what was going on in your life when the symptom began. And she got divorced. And so she got divorced, and she had been wanting to get divorced for a while. So she finally got divorced. And so you'd think, okay, so that's the resolution of the conflict. Yes, when the resolution occurs, that's when we have the symptom of itching, of inflammation, of pain, because that's when the body is restoring those lost tissue cells. And so we have loss of tissue for the ectodermal tissue cells. We lose the tissue during the conflict. We dig the hole, and then we have to fill the hole back up. And when we fill the hole back up, when we're restoring those tissue cells, that's when you have itchy, inflamed, a flare up, a breakout of something. But that's when your body is restoring. Now, if it was just a single conflict that she, wanted to separate and then she resolved the separation, the rash would be gone in a couple of weeks. but it was going on for months. This persisted and persisted. That's where we had to figure out, okay, well, what's still going on? If you divorce this person, why is your body still reacting to this? Well, she had a 9-year-old son. And so she had a child with the person that she separated from. And now she was dealing with needing to send her child with the person that she's separated from. And so every time there was a text message, every time there was, a court meeting, things having to do with sharing the custody of her child, she was reactivated with this separation. She wanted to bring her son. Where do you hold your child? Where do you hold your baby? Right
Mm,
here, right up
mm,
against your chest, right in your center, right exactly where her rash was, exactly where this psoriasis was. And so what was happening is that she was chronically in this state of wanting to bring her child close and not wanting her child to be away from her at her ex's. And that was the track. And so it doesn't matter if she ate the most perfect diet, if
yeah.
she, kept taking steroids forever
It was an
until she.
emotional problem, not a physical problem, was it? That was the root cause. Yeah. Yeah. My grandmother, funnily, you should say that. My grandmother on my father's side, she's passed on now, unfortunately, but she lived until she was 96. But she suffered really bad from psoriasis. That bad, she had to be hospitalized and put in a bag, right? Because it was that raw, and it went on for years. And I've never known why, but she separated from my granddad. I think in the 1980s maybe, but it was 1970s, and it was quite rare to do that. It might have even been earlier than that. It was quite a rare thing for families to separate at that time. So now you've said that and put it into context, and unfortunately, the last 2 years, 3 years at least, she had dementia. Right? And I know I've heard you talk about dementia as part of a separation conflict. Is that correct?
Yeah, so again, the memory loss to
Yeah,
help to cope with this separation, we lose the memory. So it's an
yeah.
adaptation to, yes, that makes perfect sense in her situation.
Yeah, you were saying that then. I was like, wow, okay. It's quite amazing, really. It's quite a completely revolutionary paradigm in our understanding of biology. That's what it's not our understanding of disease so much. It's understanding how the human body works, isn't it? I think maybe it's a good time to give our audience, if they don't know already, a brief introduction into the 5 biological laws that Dr. Harmer established. I'm going to post your video, the 101 video above here. So if anyone wants to listen to that in more detail, they can watch that video after this podcast. Could you give us an introduction into the 5 laws? Because I think that's the bedrock of it all, isn't it?
Definitely. So
Yeah.
the first law is the iron rule of cancer or the psyche brain organ connection. So this is where, depending on what happens, the shock that occurs, immediately at that moment, simultaneously, the psyche brain organ, they adapt to whatever needs to happen depending on the conflict. So again, if it's a death fright, there is an impact in the brain stem and the lung adapts. If it is a loss conflict for a woman, the conflict will register in the cerebral medulla and the ovary will adapt. And so depending on what happens, we have the shock, occurs in the psyche. The brain is impacted in a very specific area that controls the organ level. And on the organ level, we either have, tissue loss, tissue growth, or functional loss. And so that is that first biological law. Then the second is the law of two phases. And so Dr. Hammer discovered, and so in medicine, in conventional medicine, they see we've got like 500 hot diseases, 500 cold diseases, and they see them as completely separate entities. So they see, anemia and leukemia as two different diseases. But what Dr. Hammer discovered is that these diseases, they operate in two phases. These adaptive programs operate in two phases. And so we have the conflict active phase, then we have the restoration phase. And so during the conflict active phase, the body shifts out of normal homeostasis and it shifts into a state of heightened sympathetic dominance. And people know this, it's fight or flight. And when you're in fight or flight, it's you can think about it like a specialized fight or flight, not generalized fight or flight, but specialized, meaning a particular organ is going into hyperdrive, going into adaptive function in order for you to survive this situation. And so during the conflict active phase, the tissues are adapting, your hands are cold, you're not as hungry, your mind is constantly thinking about the problem. And all of these things are to help you to get you to that place of resolution. So that's the conflict active phase. Then you shift into the healing phase following the resolution. You have to resolve the conflict. If there is no resolution to the conflict, the adaptation will just continue. So we have to resolve the conflict. And then we can shift into that repair phase. So PCLA, so that's post conflictolysis or conflictolysis, after the conflict is resolved, we shift into restoration. And that's where we're swollen on the tissue level and on the brain level. So you might have pressure in your head, you might have a headache, swelling. You're like, oh, my body is so achy and tender. It's because it's a construction site. And so when tissues are healing, they need fluid. And so that fluid is an effort of healing. The inflammation is always healing. And that happens until you get to the point of maximum swelling on the brain level and the organ level. Then there's a big squeeze. We don't want to keep swelling, swelling, swelling. There's a limit point. And when you hit that point, the body shifts gears. You go into the epicrisis, the healing crisis. So this is the big squeeze. You can also see this in birth. So you get to the point of maximum swelling during the pregnancy, and then there's a big squeeze. There are these sympathetic surges in order to squeeze out the edema on the brain and organ level. And then you move into the scarification phase where the body is continuing to restore that tissue. So that's the law of two phases. And this is so important for every individual to understand so that ooh, my hands are cold right now. I'm not hungry. I can't stop thinking about this thing. I'm in conflict. There are tissues in my body that are adapting to help me. I need to find a resolution to this, either a practical resolution. I need to shift something about my life. I need to leave that job. I need to take my kid out of school. I need to do something in my life to shift this, or I need to access, a spiritual resolution, something within me, a perception shift where I am seeing this situation differently. Let's say the situation can't change. So for the example of that woman I was giving before, she was going to have to continue to allow her son to visit his father. It was a legal thing. So she couldn't practically the resolution would be you never have to see him again. Your child stays with you. You never have to part from him ever again. She had to, come to terms with the fact that resolution wasn't possible to her. So she had to shift within herself her perception of the messages from her ex, of the times that her child was going there. How could she see it in a different way? And that was the work that she and I did together because, that's the crux of everything. If she continued to react to every time the child was parted from her, she would continue to have the psoriasis. Her body would continue to go through that adaptation. So she had to shift within herself her perception, which allowed her body to finish that repair program and completely clear up this psoriasis that had been going on for over 6 months. But that resolution is very important. And so that's the second biological law.
Hey, just a reminder, as you know, I am a paranoid tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist fighting an uphill struggle against the soy boy censors at YouTube who continue to suppress my channel to prevent the truth from reaching you. So by clicking the big red subscribe button below, you're giving the middle finger to YouTube by supporting independent content creators like me. So if you've got what it takes, subscribe today. Now back to the action. So with your work, and you applied these laws to the patient that you're giving us the example of, did her conflict resolve and the psoriasis go away?
Yep, it did. And so she had to work on it because it was a persistent thing. Again, we had to look at all the tracks. What are all of the things in her life that is
Hmm.
reminding her of this separation? So like I
Hmm.
said, the text messages, every time the child had to go. So all of these things, and that's how you have to think of it. If you've got a chronic conflict, there's tracks, which means
Yeah.
that your body is remembering the original conflict. So even something like food, for example. So a lot of people think, oh, food, gluten, dairy, that causes inflammation.
Yeah.
And that inflammation is what's causing my psoriasis. So if I cut the food out and I never eat gluten and I never eat dairy and I, never eat sugar, then I'll have zero inflammation in my body and my symptoms will go away. But people have experienced the most extreme diets where they
Yeah.
eliminate everything and their
Yeah.
symptoms persist.
I'm doing one at the moment. Yeah, so I'm doing like a hardcore carnivore, right? And when I switch to that diet, it's that my kind of gut issues, right? And I can get bloated and it can get swollen very quickly with the wrong food. And I stopped. I did an elimination diet, and I just did beef, salt, water, and I'm still doing that. Few things come in, and the inflammation just goes right down. So either there's a conflict shock going on that's deeper than what I can understand currently, or I'm reacting to food for some reason as a, I don't know. Maybe you could tell me.
So that's the thing, if you are reacting to the food, it's not that the food is having no impact. The
Yeah.
food, though, isn't the source, and that's where we have to again, we have to look at what's the true cause. The
Mm,
food acts as a warning signal. So if you had this indigestible morsel conflict or a separation conflict or some type of conflict while you're eating food, that food, the body takes a snapshot of everything relevant that's going on, and it can flag the food, flag the perfume, flag the time of year. So, springtime allergies. When it's
mm,
springtime, I get allergies. Well, that indicates that during the springtime, when there was pollen in the air, you had a conflict shock, you had a stink conflict, and your body registered that pollen. And it says, okay, when the pollen is around, there might be this irritation, this frustration. So we have to adapt the sinuses preemptively. So
mm.
and we have to again think back to the ancient, think back to when this was very relevant. So if you were an animal and you're, going to get a sip of water at the water hole and there's a juniper bush there and you go down to get a sip and you all of a sudden are being encroached on by a predator and being chased, wouldn't it be super important for your nervous system to register juniper bush? When the juniper bush is around, we might need to adapt to get the hell out of there so we can survive.
So it's so weird, isn't it? Is that, those survival mechanisms were adapted to being maybe in the wild, but now it's reacting to things that are happening that it wasn't adapted for, like, foods or societal influences. It seems to me that that's the problem, is that the body doesn't know what's going on and we don't know what's going on. We're getting conflicted by these multiple stimuli that are alien to us. Now, I know you've mentioned a couple of times about stink conflict and separation conflict. Is there a category? Is there a list of conflicts, or is it innumerable?
Well, there are a list of conflicts. So Dr. Hamer mapped out the entire body and all of the conflict themes and how they adapt. And that's actually the third biological law is
Okay.
that we look at the different layers of our embryology. So he looked back, he uses the word ontogenetic. So we have to look at the origins. Where did these bodies come from? We have to look at the very beginnings of the physical huge bodies we have started with two cells that came together and began to differentiate. And when
Mm.
the cells begin to differentiate, they split up into three fundamental germ layers. So germination. This is these embryological germ layers go on to become all of the various tissues of our body, but these are the building blocks. And so we
So
have
there are only
the
three layers to the human organism, really.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That then differentiate and mold all together, so like when you have a house, you're putting the house together with multiple pieces. You have brick, you have drywall, you have, planks, you have all these different pieces that come together that build the house. Same thing with our bodies. We have all of these tissues that weave in together to form the organism. So, an organ can have all the germ layers present depending on which layer we're looking at. So we've got the yellow group. So the yellow group is the oldest, that's the endoderm, and that's controlled from the brainstem. And that's going to be the most basic functions. The most, so think of an organism that lives and floats in the ocean, just a single celled little tiny thing. All it does is bringing in a morsel of food and expelling that morsel. It's respirating, it's bringing in oxygen, and then it's reproducing. That's its whole life. It's not worried about territory. It's not worried about its self value. It's not worried about its position in society. That's the survival adaptations of the yellow group. And so during the conflict, these tissues proliferate. We have more cells, so we can produce more digestive juices, so we can digest the morsel. We can produce more lung alveoli, so we can take in the air morsel. We produce more of the tissue so that we can do whatever that tissue does better. It goes on hyperdrive. It goes into this mode where Dr. Hammer did a study where he took a test tube and so he took a test tube of normal stomach mucosa with nutritive fluid and then also a ball of ground beef. And then he took another test tube with cancerous stomach mucosa with nutritive fluid. Then that's just to keep the cells alive. And then a ball of ground beef. And he found that the cancerous stomach mucosa digested that ball of ground beef 10 times faster than the normal. And so that's the
Wow.
thing is it's doing this for a purpose. When you have stomach cancer, when you have colon cancer, that tissue is going into this hyperdrive mode so that you can better digest whatever morsel it is that you're working on. So can't we see how brilliant that is? Can't we see how that is intentional and purposeful and not an error? And so that's how the endoderm functions. Now, the mesoderm is split into old and new. So the old behaves more like the endoderm and the new behaves more like the ectoderm. So the old mesoderm is controlled from the cerebellum. And so this has to do with when organisms moved out of the primordial sea and onto the land, we needed an extra layer of protection. And so this is a protective layer. This is the deep dermis skin. It's the pleura, the pericardium. These are these protective coatings around our organs. And these tissues also, they thicken when you have a conflict. So an example of this would be something like melanoma. If you feel attacked or feel soiled, the body builds a shield. And that's what a melanoma is. It's a shield. It's protecting you from something that's attacking you or something that's soiling you. An example in my own life that was blew my mind when I first learned this was acne. That acne
Mm,
is also a program of the dermis of feeling attacked or feeling soiled. And so again, extra cells during the conflict, and when the conflict is resolved, the body uses bacteria to decompose those cells when they're no longer needed. Same thing in the endoderm. When those cells aren't needed anymore, that's what bacteria are for. That's
yeah.
why we have bacteria, more bacteria than we have human cells in our body because they are there as seasonal workers. They're there to help us. Once our conflict is resolved, the body says, "Oh, we don't need this extra cell anymore because she's not dealing with this morsel." So the body decomposes it using this ancient bacteria. And then once the conflict is over, the bacteria go back to their dormant state and they just hang out in our tissues doing their thing until we need them. They're just there as seasonal workers. Now we have the new mesoderm. So the new mesoderm is controlled from the cerebral medulla or the cerebral white matter. And this now has to do with our form and our structure. So this is our self-value. This is all the connective tissues, which for myself, my background is I'm a chiropractor. So I dealt with physical musculoskeletal complaints, neck pain, back pain, joint problems. And, I used to think that it's, just misalignments. You're misaligned. But there would be people that, would come in for their adjustments and they'd still have problems even after they're doing all the right things, but I was missing this piece. And this
Yeah.
piece has to do with self devaluation. And so the musculoskeletal tissues, when we devalue ourselves, when we are feeling not good enough, not smart enough, not strong enough, like a bad spouse, like a bad mother, like a bad athlete, the body hears that message and it erodes the musculoskeletal tissue during the active conflict. But again, this is purposeful. The new mesodermal tissues Dr. Hamer called the luxury group because what they do is they erode during the active phase. So when you're devaluing yourself, your ligaments are getting thinner, your bones are getting thinner, your muscles are getting thinner. But when you resolve the conflict, the body rebuilds that ligament, rebuilds that muscle, rebuilds that lymph node to make it stronger than it was before. It's the luxury group. So if you successfully resolve a self-devaluation conflict, your body makes that area the strongest. Like they say, when you break a bone, that bone's the strongest bone in your body. That's how this is operating. We lose the tissue during the conflict. When we resolve it, the body reinforces it and makes it stronger and bigger than before.
So one of the biggest problems we face currently is that we don't know how to resolve these conflict issues, and they become chronic, and we live with them for, years, decades, lifetimes. And that the body is just reliving these conflicts and therefore creating, layer upon layer upon layer of swelling and all these healing modalities. Is that what's happening?
Totally. So yeah, you're a little kid and you're on the soccer team and you get knocked over and the kids laugh at you and you say, "I'm not a good athlete." And then you form. So because that was such, you don't have perspective when you're 5 years old. All you have
Mm,
is this experience and this hurt and I'm not good enough. And so that story tends to stay stamped in your psyche. And
yeah.
so you start seeing every experience through the lens of I'm not good enough. I'm not a good athlete. No one wants to be my friend because I lost the soccer game for everyone. And so you go around wearing those lenses of that trauma. And so your body is constantly chronically adapting to that. And so
Mm.
you'll what do you it changes the people you attract into your life, the things that you do and that you don't do. Your whole life can be shaped by, just a soccer game when you were 5 years old where you didn't, no one recognized, wow, she took that really hard. Like, let's talk to her about this. Let's help her come out of this isolation. And that's the beauty of knowing this knowledge and this wisdom, is that you operate differently in the world. You parent your children differently. You speak to them differently. You support them differently when you understand that if this goes unresolved, if she doesn't have anyone to talk to about this, and if she stays locked up in her psyche with this conflict, that could stay with her whole life. But when you
Yeah.
recognize and you're sensitive to that, you're going to be, more communicative with your children. You're going to share with them, how this works. And so, I mean, it's a total societal rearrange when we implement this.
It feels like it's a vulnerability in the organism that, something as minor as a bad day on the football pitch can affect your entire life. As maybe that's because, we've lost this wisdom or deliberately been led away from this wisdom so that, it's easy for us. I'd say it's probably easier to control traumatized individuals than it is, people who are strong. So maybe that's one of the reasons, but it seems like it's a weakness in the organism that is being exploited.
Well, certainly you could, I mean, and depending on how nefarious you think that people are,
Mm,
certainly that we can exploit this intentionally for people, but biologically it's just makes sense because, think about in nature, if an organism, is not strong enough, the pack, what's the most useful thing for the survival of the pack is for the weak one to, be feed for the lion so everybody else can get away. And so, we have to that's where we have to bring this ancient understanding into our
mm.
modern lives,
It's quite
because
ruthless.
it is, but
Yeah,
that's how nature operates. Nature
yeah.
does what makes sense. And so
Mm,
when we are operating under the laws of nature, we start doing more of what makes sense. And so everything about modern life doesn't make sense biologically. And
no,
when you
yeah.
live without accordance to your biological nature, you will suffer. And
Mm,
that's and it may be harsh, but that's again the way of nature.
yeah. So, okay, that's the third law, is it? There's
We
two
almost
more?
finished. We
Okay,
we
yeah,
almost
yeah,
finished. We
sure.
have to do ectoderm, the
Okay, oh,
red
yeah, there's one more, yeah.
the red group. That was actually the example with the skin. This is the ectoderm. So this is the most recently evolved layer, and also the most recently evolved area of brain, which is the cerebral cortex, the lining of our skin, the lining of our ducts. And so this conflict, during the active conflict, there's loss of tissue, like I mentioned, and then restoration of tissue. This has to do with society. This has to do with relationships, sexual conflicts, territorial conflicts, connection conflicts. And so these are, we have to look at early life experiences of territorial loss. This is also where all of our mental health conditions come from, combinations of conflicts impacting us, which cause our brain to shift into even more hyperdrive, a thing called the constellation. So when the constellation occurs, this is where the body is trying to help us instead of being bombarded and continuing to adapt our physical organs. Because when a child is bombarded with, a territorial anger conflict and a scare fright conflict, it's too much. And so when the
Mm,
brain is overloaded with multiple conflicts, we shift into super sense. So the body will shift into like an autistic constellation or a megalomania constellation.
could you
We'll
just,
have
sorry to interrupt you, could you just explain constellations for me? Because that seems like it's a new idea that I haven't grasped before.
Yeah. So when we have a conflict, and these
Yeah.
are mostly in the cerebral cortex conflicts, the territorial conflicts, we have this shock that affects one side of the brain. And then if we have one that affects the opposite side of the brain, so this one's
Mm,
unresolved, we didn't resolve this conflict, and we have another one. So
yeah.
the brain has been bombarded with two conflicts. What happens, and Dr. Hammer, he mapped all of this out. It is the most mind blowing. I'm still working to really understand all of the dynamics because it's very intricate and how it changes our hormone levels, how it changes a female to a male to a female. It's wild. It explains sexuality, explains the whole spectrum of sexuality.
Wow.
Topics that affect opposite sides of the brain. And so when we are bombarded with this, the body will shift into a super sense in order to help you to escape, to find a solution to this problem. One of the conflicts is it's called a flying constellation, which causes you to kind of leave your body in some senses. So people who feel disembodied, they feel like they're floating up above their body, they're in a flying constellation because their psyche deemed that this is too much to handle down here at the regular human level. We need to actually leave. So people who are really interested in outer space or spirituality sometimes will see that they have these certain tendencies. And Dr. Hamer did these brain scans and found that they had a particular arrangement of conflicts in their brain, causing them to exhibit these kind of spacey, out there sort of characteristics. And so, mental characteristics that we see in people, bipolar, depression, schizophrenia, can all be explained by understanding constellations and how the brain has been impacted by multiple conflicts that went unresolved. And so, this is, again, like very complex, very
Yeah.
interesting, but, anyone who's interested in mental health, first learn the basics and then, eventually learn the constellations, and it will blow your mind.
Because there's like the three layers of the brain, isn't there? There's the reptilian brain, which is the original, then the mammalian brain, which is next, and then finally the human brain, which is on the outside on the top. Is that where these constellations happen? Is on that level of the brain?
You can have constellations in the brainstem as well, in the
Yeah.
cerebral medulla as well, but most of the ones that are the mental health conditions, those are the ones that are in the cerebral cortex. Yes.
Okay. Cool. So okay, continue with the five laws.
Yeah, so those are the 4 laws. This is how you're going to understand, which tissue you're dealing with and what type of symptoms, whether you're in the conflict phase or the healing phase. You need to learn this map so that you can decode your body. Now, when we move into the fourth law is the ontogenetic system of microbes. And I already mentioned this a little bit before, that microbes live in our tissues. They just hang out there. They are there as seasonal workers and they only become active when necessary. So, for the yellow group, when we build up additional tissue cells, when we have a tumor that grows, tubercular bacteria is there to decompose. So, people have heard of tuberculosis, and that the idea of it is a contagious something that I cough onto you, you get it, and then it causes a problem in your body. So, what's the solution? Antibiotics for everyone or vaccinations for everyone to prevent the tubercular bacteria from operating in the body. But what Dr. Hammer discovered is that the tuberculosis serves a function. We had a death right conflict. Something shocked us. We were afraid for
Mm.
our lives. The body built additional cells in the lung, extra alveoli cells to absorb more oxygen. So we're building up this tumor for as long as, let's say, your child's been sent off to war and you're terrified that they're going to die. And so the tumor's growing, growing, growing. And then the war is over and your child comes home and they're safe. And you're like, oh, what a relief. We resolved the conflict. So now you've got this extra mass of cells in your lung. The body says, we don't need this anymore. And what it does is the brain turns on the bacteria. Bacteria operate under instructions from the brain, and the tubercular bacteria decompose. They break down this tumor that's no longer needed. And so you cough up smelly sputum and blood and we think, "Oh no, you have a scary disease." But what's actually happening is your body is in the healing and repair phase and it's
Wow.
removing this tumor that's no longer needed, and it needs the bacteria in order to do that. If the bacteria are not present because of hypersanitation, because you never put anything in your mouth when you were a kid because your parents were super paranoid about bacteria, you don't have those the bacteria present in your body, the tumor will encapsulate. And so that's the less ideal scenario, is not having the bacteria, because now you've got this encapsulated tumor that's taking up space, and then later on you'll may get x-rayed years later and they say, "Oh, you've got a benign tumor in your lung." And what
Mm.
that means, we resolved the conflict but didn't have the appropriate bacteria, so it couldn't be decomposed.
So the body has stored the tumor because it doesn't know what to do with it.
Because it doesn't have the necessary bacteria to decompose it, because the bacteria are, think of them like
Yeah,
surgeons, which
yeah.
is anything. They do
That's
something.
kind of contrary to what we understand bacteria to be, and we're constantly trying to fight them and disinfect them and antibiotics and all these things that we're constantly told to destroy the bacteria in our microbiome. And the reality is that they're there to do us a favor.
Yep, they're there
Yeah.
doing us a favor, they're working for us, and that's what happens in the old brain. In the mesoderm, they assist either, again, with tissue breakdown or tissue buildup. Some bacteria will actually help to rebuild the bones. So the bacteria, just think of them as workers, microsurgeons. They're there, they're helping. If you ever get tested positive for some bacteria, say, oh, that bacteria is doing a job. And
Mm.
apparently I had a conflict and needed that bacteria in order to complete the job.
Well, so what happens to the encapsulated tumor then? If we can't break it down because the bacteria isn't present, how do we break it down? Or do we just have to live with that until it's
Just
either
live with it.
removed surgically or some other means?
Exactly. It just, you'll just live with it. There are certain tumors where if they're not broken down, you might have accelerated hyperfunction. So let's say the thyroid, for example. Let's say you have a
Hmm.
thyroid gland tumor, and that has to do with being too slow to get a morsel. I wasn't fast enough. So the body built up additional thyroid gland so that you
Hmm.
would speed up and get the thing that you needed. Now, if you don't have the proper bacteria and you have extra thyroid cells, you may have hyperfunction because the body couldn't decompose that extra tissue. And so you might have just a hyperfunction thyroid. And if you wanted to normalize that, you would have to have it removed. So
Hmm.
if and so that's why it's important for us to have plenty of bacteria for children to put dirt in their mouth and to get exposed to the whole environment because those
Hmm.
helpers, you want them in your system when they are needed. So yes, if it encapsulates, it may just be there, and it may not do anything. You may not even be aware that it's there for the most part. A lot of people have encapsulated tumors and have no idea until they
Hmm.
have, a random scan of some sort. And then, they have to go, oh no, we have to check if it's cancerous. And then you have a biopsy. But again, if you understand this, you
Yeah.
operate differently.
It's like we've just been through 2 years of, a health crisis in which we saw, an obsessive demand for constant disinfection and cleaning of hands and, hiding mouths. And it seems that that's contrary to what we understand here.
Totally contrary. If you have the good fortune of coming across someone who has an active tuberculosis,
Rub them,
with
get them to
get
breathe on you.
them to
Yeah.
breathe on you, get them to cough in your face because you want those bacteria because they're there helping you. The ectoderm, the red group, this is where the, alleged viruses exist.
Mm.
And Dr. Hammer said viruses, if they exist, because, if you've gone down the rabbit hole of looking at the actual science that they're passing off as science, which is totally smoke and mirrors, is all of
Yeah.
virology, is smoke and mirrors. They abuse these tissue samples, they put antibiotics in them, they starve them, they do all this stuff to a tissue sample, and then they zoom in and say, aha, this is the virus that's causing all this problem. And now they create these elaborate strategies to outwit this virus. And what the virus is evidence of adaptation. That's
Mm.
it. It's evidence that the red group tissue, that the ectodermal tissue has been eroded and then is restoring. And that is so whether we're looking at the lungs, if we're looking at, the COVID virus, what's that? It's evidence of adaptation in the bronchial mucosa. HPV, what's that? It's evidence of adaptation in the cervix. Everything that we call a virus is simply evidence that that tissue has eroded and regenerated. The body
Mm.
went through an adaptive process, but it's endogenous, meaning it comes from the tissues themselves. It doesn't come from an outside source. The body produces this adaptation. And so that's where we get completely out. The fourth biological law, there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to vaccinate against. There's nothing that we need to be afraid of. In the
Mm.
realm of bacteria, there are native bacteria to the area that I live. And in nature, you're not flying to Mexico. You're not flying to, a different country where you're going to get
Yeah.
exposed to a bunch of new bacteria. You'd be traveling and you'd gradually get exposed to whatever the natural milieu of bacteria in that area would be. But when we travel and you get, new interesting bacteria in your system, and this is the big thing, you have to be resolving a conflict. So, for example, if someone gets traveler's diarrhea, it's
Hmm.
not simply that they drank the water and the water caused a problem, because I guarantee you there are people who drank the water who didn't have diarrhea.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
always the case. So if you drank the water and you have diarrhea, it's because you resolved an indigestible morsel conflict. That's
You
you have
resolved it.
you resolved it. And so when you resolve an indigestible morsel conflict after you've been exposed to, new water, new bacteria, you may have more intense symptoms because your body is assimilating and getting used to the new bacteria that you've introduced into the system. I have
So
a friend that
somebody
helped.
who so somebody who drank the water and didn't get diarrhea, they have an unresolved conflict shock.
They might not have a conflict at all. So if
I'd say, yeah.
they didn't have any symptoms, they're unconflicted. Their body just takes in these new bacteria, they're on board now, but they
Yeah.
didn't resolve a conflict, so they didn't have any symptoms. So that's
Yeah.
the thing, is you have to look, it's not simply presence of the bacteria that causes the symptoms. There has to also be a conflict, and then
Mm,
that conflict has to be resolved in order to manifest the symptoms.
mm. Well, it's quite complicated, really, isn't it? Well, maybe it's simple once you understand it, because you've got a very good grip on it. You really understand it. So keep going.
Law is the quintessence, which is
Yeah.
the understanding that nothing in nature is malignant. Everything is meaningful. This is this zoomed out, bigger picture that there's no evil in nature. Like one of my mentors says, "Is the day good and the night evil?
Mm,
Is the fox who catches the rabbit, is that evil?" Well, no, it's sensible. It's biological. Everything that the body does makes sense and is purposeful and isn't random. And this allows us to look at whatever's going on in my body. If I can tap into this is meaningful, even if it doesn't make sense to my modern mind, even if it doesn't make sense in my modern context, my body is ancient, and that ancient body kind of predates what I think about it. And
mm,
by respecting and understanding our biology in this way, again, like we've mentioned several times, it changes the way you operate in the world. The way that society is currently constructed is almost tailor made for people to have conflict, starting with when a woman becomes pregnant. From the prenatal visits, the ultrasounds, the checking for problems, the trying to figure things out, and taking all these blood tests and doing all these things, it already implies to the fetus there might be something wrong with me.
mm,
I might be in danger. This might be a problem. I might, and so we don't think about how impactful how the mother is experiencing her world, her life is impacting on that fetus. And that's where conflicts can even begin in the womb. And
mm.
and that's why, one of my big passions is helping young women to understand this, women who want to be mothers, to understand this before they ever get pregnant, because that way you have this map, you have this guidebook, how your body, what it's doing, what's going on. If you have a symptom during pregnancy, when you have your baby, the birth process itself, what happens in those moments after birth. In the conventional world, babies all over the world are being born today and being taken away from their mothers. And that is that first separation conflict, because in
Yeah.
nature, to be away from your mother is certain death.
Yeah.
And so the cascade of conflicts that can begin just because of that early separation, washing the baby off, putting a hat on the baby's head so the mom can't smell the baby, and
Mm,
the baby can't smell the mom because everybody's disinfected and swabbed, and it's just completely unbiological. That
yeah.
sets up the cascade for conflict.
Mm.
And when we understand this, we operate differently so that we're not setting ourselves up for quite as much conflict.
So it seems to me that the best way to heal using German new medicine is to simply understand German new medicine, is to simply understand the biological mechanisms that make us human. And once you do understand those, is that the conflict, trauma of anxiety, of these false ideas that disease is killing us when actually it's our body adapting to some, conflict, it can be quite revolutionary in itself, just understanding it. It seems to me, because I kind of found German new medicine because I've been in a little bit of a journey looking into trauma. But there's quite a lot of research at the moment into trauma, and you've got Van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps Score, which is becoming something of a modern classic. And one of the reasons I kind of went into that, I was looking into it because he mentioned something about like 90% of people with drug and alcohol abuse have had childhood trauma. And basically, there is no such thing as an addictive personality. It's people who have been traumatized as children, and those traumas remain unresolved. Yeah. And they're constantly reliving them. And the way that they deal with them is through drugs and alcohol. And they're finding that this is something of an epidemic level, whether it's drugs from big pharma, whether it's alcohol from the big brewers. A lot of people are making a lot of money on the back of people being traumatized. And I've kind of got an idea that traumatized people are consumers because they consume and consume and consume in order to push the pain away or to, dull it, as it were. So in a consumerist society, it makes sense for those at the top who are raking in unbelievable fortune is to have populations who are traumatized in order to create these consumers, because nobody consumes more than a traumatized individual. And it's maybe conspiratorial, but I think there's a lot of evidence that points towards it, that we experience mass traumatic events. And maybe the health crisis over the last 2 years was a mass trauma in order to create a new wave of population that are consumers, if you like. What's your take on that, on the idea that the people in the elite, as it were, understand conflict shock, understand that humans react these ways when they're traumatized, and they use it as part of a control mechanism?
Yes, 100%. Everything that you described, it makes perfect sense. And Dr. Hammer, his work was suppressed for a reason. He went to prison because of, violating these different
I went to
natural.
prison.
He went to
I didn't
prison.
I didn't know that. Could you tell
Had
us a
his
little bit about that?
Yeah, he had his license taken away, he went to prison, and,
Wow.
his work, he presented it to the universities, University of Tübingen, and they couldn't look at it. They Behind closed doors, he found out that they verified it. They verified it behind closed doors, and he was, called upon. So he had several private clinics that ended up getting shut down, after his license was taken away, getting charged with, practicing medicine without a license. He's had university level verification, which is really the gold standard in science and medicine. Is if a university board, if you present this work to them and they verify it, that's kind of the highest level of verification. And at this point, that has happened in Dusseldorf, in Vienna, in Ternava. So he's had these independent university principles of his work. So he'd go in front of these boards and he would take a case and prove all the biological laws. He'd have a person come in with symptoms and he'd have their brain scan, and then he'd just start talking to them. There's this great story in it was the in Ternava. He was doing this verification. So he was taking 8 different cases. And so they're like, okay, Hammer, tell us what's gone on with this person. He came in with neurological symptoms and really bad balance problems. And so Dr. Hammer looked at his brain scan and he saw that in the cerebellum, there was a central edema. So, like this large edema swelling in the cerebellum. And that was the source of his balance issues. And so he knew based on his map, based on, what he had discovered about the body, that in that area, that's the area that controls the pericardium. And so the pericardium, that is that surrounding capsule around the heart. And it responds to an attack against the heart conflict. And so, based on looking at the brain scan, Dr. Hammer starts questioning this patient in front of this board of all of these, these university doctors, and he's asking him about heart issues because, so what's an attack against the heart? It's feeling like something's wrong with your heart, being diagnosed with a heart condition, something that's an attack against the heart. So he starts asking questions. Did your wife have a heart issue? Did your parents have a heart issue? Did you have a child with a heart issue? And so for over an hour, he's asking about these heart issues to this patient. And he's like, no, nothing, nothing, nothing. And the board is just kind of, like, okay, Hammer, maybe you're wrong. Maybe there isn't a conflict. They're kind of getting tired of this questioning. But the hour goes by and Dr. Hammer keeps questioning. And he goes, did you have a dog with a heart issue? And then all of a sudden, the patient tells a story from 20 years ago
Mhm.
where he hears a dog. So I guess it was a festival going on where he was living, and the festival they would eat goose. And so this dog starts barking, and there was a goose thief in his backyard the night before this festival trying to steal his geese for the festival. And so he goes out there to confront the thief, and the thief turns around and has an axe and swings the axe and hits him an inch from his heart into his chest. And so he's, laying there, and I guess he gets found and taken to a hospital and, survives the whole ordeal. But we know what happens with traumas like this. Why didn't it just pop to this man's mind? Oh, we suppress it. We suppress
Yeah,
these traumas that happen to us because they're
yeah.
shocking.
Mm.
And so the whole, the board of these university doctors, their just jaws are dropped because he's explaining this story of very clearly what's more an attack against the heart than an axe into
Mm.
your chest. And so it wasn't until Dr. Hammer asked him about the dog, and the dog barking was what kind of got him to remember this conflict that happened. And then he had to find out, well, why if the conflict was 20 years ago, why is he only having the healing symptoms? Because the swelling in the brain is the healing symptom. Is he only having it now? And it was because he started having some health issues, and his son moved him to the city instead of his country home where the goose thieving happened all those years ago. So he was constantly on a track where his body was remembering, oh, the
Yeah.
neighbor
And he
was,
could come back
the
at any
one that
moment. Yeah,
exactly. And so
yeah.
even So the nervous system, the ancient biological mind was like, watch out for neighbors in
Yeah.
this area. You watch out for your neighbors. He moved to the city. So he's not in that environment. He's not having that track triggered all the time. And so his brain's into this 20-year healing in the
Mm,
cerebellum. And cerebellum's a pretty small place. And so when there's swelling there, there's a lot of pressure, which was causing this man's his inability to walk and his balance issues. And it's like, this is how it works. And he knew it and he knew to keep questioning. And here are those doctors skeptical of him, but it's always the case. And that's the thing about these biological laws is he wouldn't write it down. Dr. Hammer was a genius and he was meticulous. He would
mm,
not write it down if he couldn't verify it in every case. If it couldn't be verified, he didn't put it in his system.
mm. Very German of him. That's what they do, isn't it? The masters of recording detail, you know. But
Totally.
it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it seems to me like he's cracked the code, or he's rediscovered the ancient wisdom, which has been suppressed and pushed off into the distance. Because if you are the elite and you need to control the population and you need them to be your slaves, right? Then you need them to do what you want them to do, and you need to be able to control them. And if they knew how to cure the trauma that is being inflicted upon them, then it becomes harder for them to control. And in a sense, it liberates you as an individual, doesn't it? I guess once you understand German new medicine, it liberates you from the need of doctors, hospitals, medicine, generally speaking. I'm sure in some circumstances that may be necessary, but you become your own doctor in a sense, and it frees you as an individual, as a sovereign individual. And that's definitely what they don't want us to discover.
Absolutely, and like you
Yeah.
said, that consumerist connection makes, that it's brilliant because
Mm,
it's the best system to keep the people suppressed, keep them, going after nicotine and alcohol and drugs, and it's like when you understand your body and when you're
mm.
minimizing trauma and you're living in this, you might use alcohol as a celebration, but you're not gonna use it daily as a numbing
Yeah.
for your trauma. You're not going to use you're the way that you live is completely different when you're not trying to, consumerism, buying things, people
Mm,
who hoard and buy things. It's a way to create this sense of safety, this sense of nest because you were abandoned as a child.
yeah.
You have an abandonment conflict, when people are hoarders and they just hoard onto everything, they need to create this sense of safety in their
Yeah.
external world by buying things, by consume like I need to consume, I need to be safe
Mm,
because they are missing that primal fundamental sense of safety because when they were a child they felt abandoned.
mm.
And so we're going to constantly be trying to fill that void that simply came because, our parents, they were busy, they had to pay taxes, they had to go to work, so we got put in daycare. And
Mm,
so and I go my whole life with this fundamental feeling of, I feel like no one's there for me. I feel like I'm all alone in this world. And so
yeah,
how do I fill that void? With stuff, with
yeah,
watching movies, with consuming media, with consuming, everything. And like you said, that's the perfect system to keep people enslaved. And this is
mm,
why this is the medicine of freedom. This is the
yeah,
knowledge that will bring freedom to the people and allow you to actually be sovereign. Because if anyone else holds the key to your health, then you're not free.
of
If
course.
I don't know where my, lump in my breast came from and my, all these symptoms, then I'm not free and I have to go to someone else. I have to sacrifice my children, to the gods of medicine and say, "Oh, please, gods of medicine, keep my child safe." And they'll, inject them with all sorts of mystery stuff when it's like
Mm,
I would never do that because I know, if my child has a rash, it's because they felt separated from me. If my child is spitting up, it's because they're angry or there's something that they want that they can't get. And so when I know that, I can treat it because I can treat the soul of my child rather than trying to just it's a the everything about the conventional world is all about materialism and the material matter of the body, not the soul. They can't ever
mm,
help the conflict because the conflict is in the soul, it's in the psyche, it's in the primal state of the being. And so we have to get back to that. Individuals, in order, if you want to be free, you have to know this knowledge. You have to
mm.
have this map. At least one person in your family needs to be proficient in knowing this, even if not everyone wants to learn all the embryology. You come to, the person in your family that knows it. And that's the way for society to become free.
I mean, because you can see the way they're doing this in the sense that I did a podcast with Professor Matthias Desmet, who wrote a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And he was one
Mhm.
of the few voices during the health crisis, right, in which he gave a technical explanation of what was happening. And he called it mass formation psychosis, right? And he explained how when there are four elements in place, that a population becomes easy to be susceptible to a mass formation. And the first one, and absolute primary, is social isolation. Is that we have to be isolated socially from our family, our friends, our peers, our groups, our communities. Because when we're isolated, it's easy for us to be attacked, isn't it? Whether it's psychically or physically or emotionally, is, we've been isolated as such. And he said that's the primary reason. And we can see that more and more within our society. Even me and you now, we're communicating over thousands of miles through technology, right? Is that we were designed and adapted for hundreds of thousands of years to live in tight groups of family, friends who we knew our entire lives. And that has evaporated. I mean, my mother, she was one of 10 children, right? So they were a big family, and that was the tail end of those big families in Britain. And then my mom had two children, which is me, and I've had one child, right? So we've gone from 10 to 2 to 1, right? So we can see how they are separating us. And like you said, you need one person in your family. I guess traditionally is that, the elder would be the one who passed on that ancient wisdom through the generational families. And that line has been broken. And how are we going to restore this idea of coming back together as communities, as families? Do we do that through technology? Because that helps us as well in some ways, doesn't it?
Definitely. And that is, the separation of the family, the destruction of the family is fundamental to,
Mhm.
the slave system surviving. It's not
Yeah.
having, when you look at these territorial conflicts, it's not having homeland, like look at, I'm in LA. It's like, this is no one's homeland. This isn't like
Yeah. Yeah.
your
Yeah.
natural state where you belong, where you can always come to. And not having that, I think that is, again, a big reason for all of these chronic conflicts, all of these, people not having children, people having fewer children. When you understand the conflicts, you see, a man who doesn't have territory doesn't want to have children. That's why
Mm,
there's so few alphas. And in nature, only the alpha reproduces, and every other
yeah.
man who's lost his territory doesn't reproduce. He doesn't want to be a father because he doesn't have any land to bring his children home to. So that
Mm,
biological, desire to reproduce is gone. And so that's why, the destruction of the alpha male, and people with infertility issues, we've got really masculine women and really feminine men because of early life sexualization and sexual conflicts. So everything from circumcision to early sexualization, we're doing
mm,
these things to these children, and it's destroying their normal feminine masculine balance, which causes, again, this society of people who are struggling with infertility. They may want to have children, they can't, because, again, if a masculine woman where she's got, low estrogen, and a man with high estrogen, they have trouble reproducing, on that.
mm,
And it's so fundamental to organisms, to species, to have that connection and family, to have
mm.
that safe place to go, to feel the sense of connection. Yes, everybody's on an island now, isolated in their problems, and they don't have the support that they need. And so it's the perfect recipe for dis-ease, and for these adaptation programs. And that's why people are sicker than ever before. Modern medicine, we put trillions and trillions of dollars into this system. They know nothing. They know nothing.
Nothing. And they admit it. They don't even pretend, do they? They go, we don't know.
But
Just
what's
take
the
that
cause of
pill.
thyroid cancer? What's the cause of colon cancer? Actually look that up and see how they do not know. But they'll sell you a treatment plan. They will give you a
Yeah.
remedy, which, again, people have to think. We are so used to not thinking. We're so used to
Mm,
outsourcing our thinking to a higher authority, to the professionals. I didn't go to school for this. Little old me syndrome is what I call it. It's an intellectual self devaluation where you think you're smart enough to know what's going on with your body. So you say, well, the doctor must know. Well, I don't know about this vaccine, but the doctor says I should get it. And I think the doctor's smarter than me. I just get it without even thinking. And so, because
mm,
we've been trained out of thinking and we let experts think for us, we, again, we're in this victim status where we just take whatever they tell us to take, and no one is thinking. And that's why, the waking up, and I think the whole pandemic has been great for people waking up, for people seeing, maybe people who,
yeah.
were on the borderline. They're like, no, this actually doesn't make sense to me, I won't do this, have kind of gone in that direction of sovereignty and freedom, and, health freedom, and doing what makes sense.
There's
And I
no
think
going
that
back.
no going back
Yeah.
for sure.
So yeah, I think we're kind of reaching. We're at a quite a sophisticated point in the slave system, right? Is that the slave system is getting ever more sophisticated in its ability to enslave, but at the same time, there is an awakening of the population who, as it reveals itself, as it reveals its claws and its true tyranny, that's when we can rise up, because it hides in the shadows largely, but now it's shown its teeth. Right. So when that happens, we can have a natural rebellion. And I believe that this is it. This is what we're talking about now, is about how we are finding a way out of the slave system and a way to live as a sovereign with a sovereign mindset. And, it's not for everyone, unfortunately, but for the people that do want to follow that path, the answers are there and the solutions are there. What are your thoughts on how modern medicine or modern psychiatry is kind of coming around to Dr. Harmer's way of thinking? Because I don't know whether it's just me, and that's because what I'm looking at right now is coming into my field of view. But it feels as if the research into trauma from the Western medicine side is coming to the same conclusions, although using different terminology than Dr. Harmer's discoveries. But we see remedies like EMDR. EMDR is kind of magical, is that you just got to move your eyes and you can resolve these lifelong traumas. And that's, it is actually a successful treatment. And then you have hypnosis, which can, bring about remedies, or even psychedelic drugs, which, small doses of magic mushrooms are healing people of their traumas. It seems to me as if Western medicine is either inevitably accepting what's happening and are just getting on board with it, or they're coming to their own conclusions. What's your view of that?
That's interesting. I don't know if I would say it's Western medicine. I think that people within
Okay.
like, so you know
Okay.
what I mean? Like it as a whole, I don't know if it's necessarily coming to that, but there are individuals that they can't ignore it any longer. And
Mm,
so, it's hard to, when you're actually paying attention and you're connecting some of these dots, you can't deny that trauma and shock and the physical health of the individual are intrinsically linked. And
mm,
so, yeah, and there's so many things, so many ways. And that's the thing, is when you understand this, it's like, well, how do you resolve a conflict? It's individual. It's within, so if you're drawn to EMDR or hypnosis or psychedelics, follow that inclination, because there's going to be something there for you in helping you to unravel, because that's kind of the key. What's it going to take for me to shift my perspective, my understanding, by accessing certain memories, by moving your eyes, or accessing through hypnosis certain locked memories. You can see this trauma, and a conflict is resolved when it can't happen again, where what happened then can't happen now. This is
mhm,
like when a child will have, allergies or asthma their whole life, and then they move out on their own and they're like, "Yeah, I must have grown out of it." Well,
mm,
what you did is you left that environment where you were being triggered by, the circumstances, your parents, the house you lived in, that was keeping your conflict active. And then when you realize you moved out on your own, I can never be grounded again. I can never be under the oppression of my parents again.
Yeah.
And so that conflict resolves because it can't happen again.
Yeah.
And so we need to, and that's what trauma healing is
Mm,
looking at the trauma through the lens of the evolved adult that I am now, and seeing, oh, what happened then can't happen now. I'm safe now. I understand why I perceived it in the way that I did, but now I don't have to perceive it in that way. It's
mm,
giving your little self the tools that your grown up self now has, and integrating that part instead of it being its own, isolated, all alone. Because that's the thing, is when you have a conflict, also your emotional maturity stops.
mm,
So your emotional maturity is frozen, especially in constellation. You get frozen at 5, you get frozen at 10, and your intellectual maturity can continue, but your emotional maturity freezes,
mm.
which is very interesting. Is why, we have a whole society of intellectuals, people who go to college for years and years and years and years. In like true biological humans aren't interested in going to college for
Yeah.
7 years. They're out making babies because
Yeah.
they're biological humans, but
Mm,
intellectual humans love to study. We love to go to school. That's why all of academia, which is, the elite, intellectual elite, they are
mm.
not biological humans. They are emotionally frozen children in adult bodies
Wow.
who are, writing papers and shaping, the way of society, but they're non-biological. They
No.
they aren't doing what their biology, they are frozen, which causes them again to be interested in the world of the intellect, the world of the mind.
Mm,
And so but when you resolve these conflicts, you can integrate. You want to integrate that frozen child self into your adult self so you can actually heal. This is a very interesting point for women in particular. So, if you have a constellation that has frozen you say, you were 11 and you saw pornography and you had a sexual conflict, and then you had another, like, and then you had a conflict of territorial loss and you got locked into a constellation and you're frozen at age 11. If that woman has babies, gets pregnant before she's 25, she has the chance to catch up on her maturity. And so this is, and again, when women go to college, and they go to grad school, they don't graduate until what? They're 25. That's what happened
Mm,
to me. I didn't graduate college and I was 25. And at that point, because 25 is the age of maturity for humans biologically, 25 is the age of maturity. And so if you have children before the age of 25, that woman can catch up on 3 years of emotional maturity for every pregnancy. So if she's, frozen at age 11, if at 20 she has a pregnancy and then at 22 she has another, she can catch up on 6 years of that emotional maturity. And so she'll have the emotional maturity of a 17-year-old rather than an 11-year-old. And so this is just a very interesting
mm,
related to constellations that Dr. Hammer discovered, but why we have such an immature society and
yeah.
so many, adults, seeming adults who are so immature. Like, and you even look at society's past, look at pictures from people from the 80s, like your parents in the 80s or in the 70s, and look at how much older they seemed.
Mm.
They had this maturity. And then you look at people now, and it's like the people I went to high school with, very few have children. Most of them are still, they're still at that same phase of life. They haven't matured because, again, unresolved trauma that is causing them to be frozen.
We don't see, especially for men, there doesn't seem to be a rite of passage anymore that take you from a boy to a man. One of those is having a family, and having a family as early as possible will, turn you to being a man. Hopefully, it'll help you resolve all the conflicts. But there is also no real tests of a man, or they're suppressed or pushed off into the distance. So men are becoming men much later, generally speaking. And another thing as well is that we are led to believe that trauma is only hardcore sexual abuse or hardcore physical abuse, and that it's not as common as it actually is. It's really quite common, isn't it? It's not this, very specialized area of human relationships. It's actually, going on every day. And we're also led to believe that resolving trauma is a lot more difficult than it is too. So that we push it off because it's too painful. I don't want to be fixing that. I've buried it. I've got it wrapped up. I don't want to have to deal with it. I think I've dealt with it, kind of thing. But my research leads me to understand that resolving trauma is not actually as long-winded or as difficult as we're led to believe. It can be quite simple and quick.
Definitely, and that is it. Little things can cause trauma, movies can cause trauma, little experiences you have in your childhood that shock you, you just weren't prepared for it.
Mm,
So it doesn't have to be something like, "Oh, I didn't have a traumatic childhood, but I must be fine." But look at, little times where you were caught off guard. Those
mm,
things can constitute trauma if you were unprepared to deal with it.
mm,
And yes, it doesn't have to take years of therapy or, like, uncovering. You can do it so quickly
mm.
by bringing conscious awareness to it and bringing, that's the thing, is we have to make the unconscious conscious, because otherwise it rules your life.
Yeah.
And so we bring that out of the subconscious. We see it for what it is. We understand it with compassion, with understanding. We understand, something that can really help is seeing the trauma through the eyes of everybody involved, like our pop out of your perspective. Because when we stay in our own perspective, when we stay isolated in the problem, and we don't talk about it, that causes it to persist. Again, from that biological perspective, the psyche's like, she hasn't resolved that. She's not, this isn't finished. And so the
Mhm,
psyche keeps the program open, keeps the program active. And
mm,
that by having the courage to look at this stuff and to look at these connections, look at the things that have happened to you and trust that, okay, I can handle this. My psyche's been hiding it from me and adapting. But if I look at it and I
mm,
see it with love and compassion and understanding, I can up level. And that's the thing, is we are halt when we don't look at our traumas, we halt evolution. Because all of these, when you're looking at this adaptive survival wisdom, really the body is resolving trauma to up level so that the next time you encounter this thing, you're like, oh, I have a solution for this.
mm,
But when we halt that, when we don't access those solutions, we stay stuck at that less evolved level. And
mm,
so humanity is at this frozen evolution where when you take pills to cover up symptoms, you don't evolve. You
mm,
you you halt that evolution, and it prevents us from becoming, the the versions of ourselves that has an answer for something. And that's what we can share. When you share a story with someone of how you resolved, how you healed something,
Mm,
that blueprint can kind of imprint on them, and they can access that solution too. And that's why talking about this stuff is so powerful.
yeah,
Getting it out in the open,
yeah.
hearing people love hearing other people's healing stories, because it's like, oh, if they can do it, I can do it.
Mm,
And that's true. If they can do it, you can do it. If anyone can resolve stage 4 cancer, you can do it. And
mm,
so, got to embed that new belief, that new understanding of yourself into your psyche to get that belief that, of course, I can do it. Of
mm,
course, I can resolve this easily. But if you hold on to that idea, it's hard, it's difficult, I'm not going to be able to do it. That belief is going to block you, and it's
mm,
going to, create what we believe to be true. And
mm.
so we have to look at your belief system, what you believe about yourself and your capacity to resolve and to heal. And so, yeah, in order to evolve, we have to address these things, get them out of the darkness and into the light.
I mean, maybe we've already evolved. Maybe we're devolving, right? Because, there's a line that you've said which I really resonated with me was ancient algorithms, right? And I thought that was a really cool term, really, really summed it up. And I know you like to talk about how our biology is ancient, and there's this deep, deep wisdom encoded within the biology of the human organism that knows how to deal with this stuff if it's just left to its own devices. And it appears to me that, there's a decisive moment in human history, which is the agricultural revolution, which for me is the beginning of slavery, right? And leading up to modern day, that before the agricultural revolution, and I've spoke to a few people about this. One is Dr. Peter Gray, American evolutionary biologist, and he's an expert on the shift between human societies from the hunter-gatherer, existence in which we were fully developed as part of the environment to this descent that we've had from the agricultural revolution, which has put us in this alien environment, which is basically captivity, because our natural design is to be nomadic, and follow the herd and follow the hunt and move around. And, you talk about this ancient wisdom. Could you expand a little bit on that?
My perspective is that, life wants to live. Life, the life principle. So, it's not just the body, it's life itself. So, like, a dead body and a living body have all the same parts, all the same organs are present. What's the difference? It's the spark of that life force, of that innate intelligence that's animating those tissues. And so life wants to survive and overcome and adapt. And that's what we're here for, is to experience challenges, to experience, differing weather conditions, different seasons, to go through and to adapt to it. And
Yeah.
so life can kind of keep on going, because that's what it wants to do. The body's primary function is the survival of the organism and then the reproduction of that organism. And it just wants to keep playing this game. I think that life is, the universe playing this game with itself of just continuing to evolve and adapt to differing circumstances. And so, yes, that's what this ancient algorithm in the body is like. Oh, I know how to keep you alive. I'm going to
Mm,
give you more thyroid cells. I'm going to take away this duct lining so you have more of this and less of that. Like the body knows exactly what to do in those circumstances. And now when we get our educated mind involved, that's been our downfall for the last several hundred years, is we think that we know what the body is doing when we know 1/1,000,000% of all of the functions of our body. This body is so wise. The fact that we can be having this conversation, and your breakfast is digesting and your body is keeping the perfect pH balance, it's keeping everything. Like, think of all the
it's incredible,
that are
isn't it? It really is incredible.
that are
Yeah.
going that's going right in your body in
Yeah.
order for you to be surviving. We like to zero in on the one thing that we think is going wrong, but if you can zoom out further and see that even this is the body expressing intelligence and doing something that is correct. My job is to start sending messages that are in alignment with what is true, that I am safe. When you sit in a safe room and you're anxious about a million things, like, you are sending your body doesn't know that your room is actually safe and there is no threat here. It only knows that via your perception and the stories that you are allowing to take up your consciousness. And so that's where, this next conscious evolution is awareness. I have
Mm,
to see, I've got to make the connection. I've got to see myself freaking out about something that isn't a present threat, see myself realizing, like, this is sending a message to my nervous system and my body is adapting to that message. I'm the one that has to change. My body is just, again, it's just doing its thing. It's doing what it's
mm.
programmed to do.
So, okay, moving into the last part of this podcast now is I think we've had a good explanation of what GNM is and how it can help and the historical nature of it. But What's your role as a GM practitioner? How do you actually help people resolve their conflict issues? What does that involve? What are the remedies?
Yep. The fundamental for me and the work that I teach people is awareness. And so I have to be aware first of the biology. I kind of have to get an understanding of this map. And so I teach that to people so that they can understand, and I want you to have an understanding. I want you to understand that when your right knee hurts, you're right-handed, that's your partner side. Physical performance self-devaluation. I want you to at least have a basic understanding of that mapping so you know what your tissues are doing. I had an indigestible morsel conflict. I had a can't swallow conflict. I had a stink conflict. I want you to be able to identify that because that again gives you that autonomy and that power. You don't have to come to me. You don't have to ask me. So that you can be that person in your family that your children can come to and say, Mommy, I have a sore throat. And it's like, oh, okay, what couldn't you swallow? Did you want to eat something? Did you not want to eat something? You're able to understand that. And then next, awareness of myself and my perception. How do I see the world and why do I see the world the way that I see it? And is that way working for me? Is it resourceful? I help people to develop a radically resourceful attitude about dealing with life stuff, whether that's old trauma, whether that's present stuff that is on my plate, whether that's stuff in the future. We have to develop a new resourceful attitude for handling this. And so we have to revalue ourselves. A big focus that I have with people is on the self devaluation theme because that I find to be one of the primary conflicts that people deal with is again not feeling smart enough to understand it, not feeling like who am I to know this? I didn't go to school for this, but empowering you that knowing that you have innate intelligence,
Mm,
you have this wisdom, you have equal access to all of this wisdom. Dr. Hammer, he was a channel for universal intelligence, spoke through him. Everyone who discovers something, but each individual, we all have access to that wisdom. We all have access to that innate and universal intelligence and that I help people to connect to that source for them to really learn how to connect with that wisdom within that knows the path, that knows the answer, that knows the way out of their problem. Because that's the thing is every problem that we have, there is a solution. There
mhm,
is a solution, but we
mhm,
have to access that solution through creativity and through imagination. Because before everything is imagined before it's real. The computer is imagined before it's real. The airplane is imagined before it's real. Your solution to your problem you have to imagine it first before it can become real in your life. And so you have to brainstorm. So, like the woman I talked about earlier with her psoriasis, we had to think of, imagine how can you feel better about this? What are ways that you can start thinking about this differently about the situation. But the mind doesn't like to change. The mind likes to do what it's always done. And so that's the thing that we're overcoming is the ego mind that wants to, that thinks that there's no way out and like is addicted to being a victim, is addicted to the problem. We have to overcome that addiction by saying, do you want to reinforce your old narrative of stuckness and victimhood? Or are you willing to sacrifice the stuckness and the victimhood to be the victor of your situation, to
mhm.
find and access solutions maybe where you thought there were none before. And so it takes this courage, it takes this ability to break away from old patterns. And so that's what I help people do is to recognize their patterns, recognize when they are, succumbing to some type of inner victim narrative that's not serving them, and so that they can see and shift out of it. And so it's a lot of inner awareness work and self observation. That's the core of my teaching.
So it's as a coach, a teacher is the fundamental aspect of being a GNM practitioner. But do you actually prescribe or advise on actual treatments, whether that be EMDR or hypnosis or even Western medicine? Is that part of your remit as well, or do you fall short of that?
My personal what I do with people is I talk to you about your relationship with modalities, with the
Okay.
things that you do. So how do you feel about some people that I've worked with have done EMDR. They're drawn to it. I
Yeah.
say do what you're drawn to. If a person is kind of considering a medical treatment, I'm not there to say yes, do it, no, don't do it. I'm
Mm,
here to talk to you. How do you feel about doing it? What's your thought process behind taking that supplement or eating that diet? And so I'm kind of like this intermediary, like I'm talking to you about your relationship with the stuff you want to do.
mhm,
And because I want you to be clear about why am I doing this? Am I doing this because it's sound and it makes sense and it's in alignment with the biological laws? Or
mm.
is it driven by fear and conventional thinking and the old model? And so that's the role that I play for people, is in helping you to clarify and understand why it is you're doing what you're doing.
Because what I found is that, especially in the age of the internet, and if we have issues, health issues, whatever they may be, right, is that because we don't get given the answers from Western medicine, because there is no diagnosis, right? There's no diagnosis. You're forced to go and find a diagnosis yourself, and the internet is awash with remedies, isn't it? You can try a million things, and I've tried them all, right? And it doesn't seem to resolve the situation that I'm looking to resolve. You may get some, light relief, but the symptoms come back, right? And then you can't figure it out, and you feel like you're going around in circles. And what I think I like about GNM is that it gives you an accurate diagnosis. And once you've got a diagnosis, you know what the problem is. Trying to find the solution without knowing what the problem is almost impossible. And you're shooting in the dark, aren't you? You're throwing things at the wall, hoping something sticks. And I think that's what I like about it. Is that what you do? Are you able to use Dr. Harmer's discoveries in order to give an accurate diagnosis of the problem?
So the symptoms tell the story. So
Yeah.
when you know the symptoms tell us this is the conflict that's going on. And then the search is for the conflict.
Hmm.
Where did it begin? What was going on in your life? And that definitely takes some searching, and it can be difficult. And that's where things like hypnosis or, EMDR, different techniques can help you to get into it. Every answer that you need is in your subconscious mind. And
Yeah.
so I help to empower people with knowing that the solution to this is within you. And you can watch for the things that trigger you now, because the things that trigger you now are going to give you a little insight into what that original conflict was. So the symptoms tell the story. You understand the symptom. We can look at the organ level. Why is
Yeah.
the organ doing this? Then we trace it back to what was the situation? What
Mm.
were you going through at this time in your life where this problem began? Is that problem ongoing? Is it unresolved? Because that's the easiest and first thing. Oh, yes, this started when I, was having relationship issues. Okay, well, are you still having relationship issues? Yes,
Mm.
I am. Okay, well, let's start there. Let's resolve these
Mm.
relationship issues and what's it going to take to put that to bed?
Mm.
That's something that I ask people frequently. It's like, okay, there's these open-ended issues. Okay, well, what's it going to take to put that to bed, to get to a
Mm.
place where this is not ongoing? Is it a practical change? Is it a divorce? Is it a marriage? Is it, is there practically something we can do? Or is it going to be something that you're making an inner transformation? You're changing your relationship and your perception of that situation. And so that's kind of how we work through things.
Okay, sounds cool. Do you offer coaching or one-to-one sessions? How does it work if any of our viewers want to contact you and they want to pursue some GNM treatment? What's the process?
Yeah, so I do a weekly class. So people who are just interested in kind of understanding this philosophy, understanding the biological laws. I have a weekly class that meets on Mondays, where we dive deep into it and people can ask questions. And so that's a great place to get started if you're just trying to gather the education. I also do one-on-one work. I take a limited number of clients. I do have a booking. You can book through my site for a session where we can get to know each other and see if we're a good fit for further work together. And so that can be booked right through my site. And then I also just, again, recommend the education. I have a YouTube channel that has a lot of videos on it. I have a blog post on my website with a lot of resources. So books and other teachers and how to get involved in learning this for yourself.
Fantastic. How can people find you online, Melissa? What are the main addresses that they can hunt you out?
Yep. Dr. Melissa Sell, SELL.com. You can look up Dr. Melissa Sell on YouTube, on Instagram, Telegram. So those would be the main ways to reach me and to find my content.
Okay, I'll put the links in the description as always. What books do you recommend to our viewers?
Again, I've got a list of books
Okay.
on my website, on the blog. There's the book from Bjorn Ebel. It's The Psychic Roots of Disease, and so he kind of and there are a lot of different groups who have taken the core of the five biological laws and have expanded on it and used their own perspectives and modalities. And there's a bit of, you could say, little territorial drama within the GNM community about like what's pure Hammer versus, which is funny because
It's
my
always.
background is in chiropractic, and there's like pure chiropractic, and then they call them mixers. And so mixers are people who like do other stuff too. And so, you might consider certain materials as being a mixer, but my personal philosophy is, I base everything on the pure Hammer, but I'm also a fan of whatever works, so there's a lot of methods and things that people have discovered and built upon, since Dr. Hammer, that have used his information to really help people. And so you can experiment with those. And some of that stuff is in Beard Ebel's book, but it's called The Psychic Roots of Disease. And it's a really great reference for people who are looking, who are trying to understand this. I find it's very user friendly. And so that's one of the books I do recommend.
Fantastic. Okay, Melissa, have you got any final words for our audience?
Yes, I just recommend that you dive into this for yourself. If you want to be sovereign, if you really want to be free, you have to know how your body works for yourself. This isn't something you just dabble in. This isn't just like, oh, yeah, I've heard of GNM, mind, body, something, some. This is a complete fundamental rearrange of your understanding of your body, of your children's body, of what dis-ease actually is. And if you're still afraid of any type of health symptom, you're not free. And this system will help you to understand and become free. This knowledge is so empowering and so powerful. And I invite you to really explore it.
Melissa Sell, it's been fantastic talking to you. It really expanded my understanding of G&M, and I'm going to continue my research into it, and hopefully we can chat again about it in the future. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
Cool. Wow, you made it to the end, a true supporter. I really hope you enjoyed the show as much as I enjoyed making it. Now, if you want to continue supporting our work and be kept up to date on what we publish, then please sign up to my free newsletter, which I'll send out once or twice a week. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join me in giving the middle finger to YouTube by pushing that big red button. And if you want to support us further, then go over to Locals where you can join our community. If you do all three, you'll be automatically entered into a competition to win a private health check with our new sponsor, Bill Gates. Until next time, thanks for tuning in.